An unexpected racial conflict erupts in a quiet suburban park when a privileged woman, angered by the presence of a homeless black veteran, decides to call the police. But instead of solving the problem quickly, this encounter sets off a chain of events that will transform both of their lives in surprising ways. What could have happened that day to change prejudice into compassion? Before we dive into this moving story of redemption, let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe. Karen Whitfield, 45, walked through Oakwood Park with an air of superiority. Her designer clothes and impeccable appearance clashed with the surrounding nature. Little did she know that her actions would set off a chain of events that would make her question her beliefs and convictions. As she rounded a bend, she spotted a black man sleeping on her favorite bench, which made her react with contempt. For Karen, this park was her refuge, and the presence of this unkempt man seemed to threaten her idea of suburban perfection. She approached him with disdain, demanding that he leave. The man, with a tired look and soft voice, apologized, readily willing to leave to avoid trouble. However, the sight of him awakened in Karen repressed memories of her own struggles, causing something dark to emerge within her. Karen felt as if she was losing control of her life, but instead of eliciting empathy, these memories only fueled her anger and resentment. "You'd better move on," she said coldly. "People like you don't belong here. You're making the park dangerous for decent people." The man simply slumped his shoulders, accepting her words without argument, having heard this kind of thing countless times before. He calmly began to gather his belongings, while Karen, without hesitation, picked up her cell phone and quickly dialed 911. "Hello, I need to report a suspicious person in Oakwood Park," Karen said, feigning fear. "There's a homeless man here, acting aggressively. I don't feel safe, send someone immediately." As she made the call, she didn't notice the disapproving looks from the others in the park. An old man feeding the ducks shook his head sadly, while a young mother slowed her jog when she noticed the situation. John Williams, the man on the bench, listened to Karen's story with resignation and a hint of disbelief. At 58 years old, after serving his country for more than 2 decades, he had faced much prejudice and hardship. When he returned home, he found a world that seemed to have left him behind, and a chain of events had led him to the situation he found himself in, homeless, struggling to survive in a system that often fails those most in need. As Karen continued to exaggerate her story, John allowed himself to remember happier times, the camaraderie with his fellow soldiers and the sense of purpose he felt in serving his country. But these memories were overshadowed by the horrors he had witnessed and the friends he had lost along the way. Karen had no idea that her actions that day would set off a chain of events that would make her question everything she thought about herself and the world around her. Sirens in the distance brought John back to the present. He sighed, knowing what was coming: suspicious looks, invasive questions, and the assumption of guilt based solely on the color of his skin. 2 police cruisers soon arrived at the park, and Karen, visibly pleased, adjusted her expensive gym jacket and assumed a distressed expression, ready to play the victim. The first officer to approach her was Michael Rodriguez, followed by his partner, Sarah Thompson. With more than 15 years of experience, Rodriguez had handled frivolous calls before, and something about this situation didn't feel right. "Good morning, ma'am," he said in a professional but cautious tone. "Did we get a call about a suspicious person?" Karen, trembling with manufactured fear, pointed at John. "Yes, officer. He was sleeping on the bench, and when I asked him to move, he became aggressive. I was afraid for my safety." Rodriguez turned his attention to John, who was still sitting on the bench, his hands visible in his lap. Something about John's posture caught her attention, a quiet dignity despite the circumstances. "May I ask your name, sir?" the officer said, his tone softer now. "John Williams, sir," John replied firmly. "I apologize for any inconvenience. I'm leaving." Hearing this, Rodriguez noticed a slight hesitation in John's words, a shrug of the shoulders he recognized from his own service. "Mr. Williams, may I ask if you served?" John's eyes met the officer's in surprise. Yes, sir. 23 years in the Navy. Rodriguez nodded, sharing a look of understanding. Thank you for your service, Mr. Williams. I served in the army as well, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Karen, who had been watching the conversation impatiently until then, interrupted, Excuse me, what does that have to do with the situation? This man is trespassing in the park and making it dangerous. I demand that he be removed. Rodriguez turned to Karen, his expression growing serious. Ma'am, Mr. Williams has not committed a crime. Being homeless is not illegal, and he has just as much right to be in this park as anyone else. Karen's face turned red with anger and frustration. This was not going as she had planned. Furious, she grabbed her phone again, this time determined to start recording. This is unacceptable, I will report this to your superiors. Karen shouted, her voice rising as she gained the attention of the others in the park. You are refusing to protect tax-paying citizens from loitering. Before she could cause any more commotion, Officer Thompson calmly intervened, Ma'am, please lower your voice. We are not refusing to act, we are assessing the situation, which is our job. As Thompson calmed Karen, Officer Rodriguez approached John and spoke quietly, Mr. Williams, have you sought assistance from veterans' housing programs? John nodded, looking weary. Yes, I have, but the waiting lists are long, and the bureaucracy, coupled with my PTSD, makes it very difficult. Rodriguez softened his expression, took a card from his pocket, and handed it to John. I see. Look, I know someone who can help you with this. His name is David Martinez, he works at the Veterans Center. Call him and tell him Mike Rodriguez referred you. Meanwhile, Karen's patience was reaching its limit. She picked up her phone, still recording, and, now out of control, let out her frustrations. This is absurd. I'm a tax-paying citizen, I have my rights. This man is a threat to our community and you're acting like he has a right to be here. Officer Thompson stepped forward, placing herself between Karen and the 2 men. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to step back. You're escalating the situation unnecessarily. But Karen was beyond listening. Months of pent-up fear, anger, and prejudice exploded in a barrage of insults. You're all the same. You protect criminals and bums while real workers suffer. I'm going to make sure you both lose your badges. She didn't realize that, all around her, several people had begun recording the incident. Her face distorted with fury and her venom-laced words were being captured on video for the world to see. Officer Rodriguez, having concluded his conversation with John, turned to Karen. Firmly but with control, he said, Ma'am, I am asking you one last time to calm down. You called us here with false allegations, saying that Mr. Williams was being aggressive when he clearly was not. Filing a false report is a serious offense. Karen's face paled in disbelief. How could this be happening? She was the victim, wasn't she? Wasn't she simply defending her community? As she marched away, still clutching her phone tightly, already planning how she would post her version of events on social media, Officer Rodriguez turned to John. Mr. Williams, is there somewhere you can go now? It would give you peace of mind knowing that you have a safe place to rest. John nodded slowly, there's a shelter on the other side of town. It's not much, but they know me. Rodriguez then pulled a $20 bill from his wallet and handed it to John. Here, for bus fare and maybe a hot meal. And don't forget to call that number. John's eyes filled with tears. It was rare for someone to show him such kindness. Thank you, sir, I really don't know how to thank you. Gathering his few belongings, he began to walk away, unaware that this simple moment would have a greater impact on his life, and Rodriguez's, in the days to come. Karen sat at her kitchen table, holding a glass of white wine, as she typed angrily on Facebook. Her fingers flicked across the keyboard, each sentence filled with indignation and a sense of self-righteousness. Shocked and appalled at the state of our community. This morning I encountered a dangerous individual in our beautiful Oakwood Park. When I called the police, they refused to act. Is this what we pay taxes for? To be exposed to criminals and thugs. We need to take back our parks and streets. She attached the video she had recorded, carefully edited to highlight only the parts that supported her version of events. With a satisfied smile, she clicked post, eagerly awaiting the likes and supportive comments that would follow. However, Karen had underestimated the situation. Her post went viral, but not in the way she had imagined. Other videos recorded by witnesses began to circulate, telling a very different story, one of a privileged woman harassing a homeless veteran and making unfounded accusations against the police. The backlash was swift and relentless. Karen's Facebook page was flooded with vitriol. People she had considered friends began publicly distancing themselves, and her phone buzzed with notifications, each one bringing more outraged comments. As the night wore on, Karen's confidence began to crumble. She had always seen herself as a community advocate, someone who stood up for what was right. But as the harsh reality of the public trial hit her, she was forced to face an uncomfortable truth: maybe she wasn't the hero of this story. Meanwhile, across town, in a crowded shelter, John lay on a narrow bed, clutching Officer Rodriguez's business card tightly. As he drifted off to sleep, he wondered if tomorrow might bring another opportunity. What neither Karen nor John knew was that their paths would cross in ways they could never have imagined, with consequences that would unfold from this unexpected encounter. Sitting at her kitchen table, Karen held a glass of white wine as she frantically typed on Facebook, recounting the morning's events. Her fingers raced across the keyboard, each sentence filled with outrage and a conviction that she was on the right side. I am shocked and appalled by what happened in our community today. This morning, I encountered a dangerous person in our beautiful Oakwood Park. When I called the police, they refused to help. What do we pay taxes for? To be left unprotected by criminals? We need to take back our public spaces. She attached a video she had recorded, carefully edited to show only what would suit her narrative. With a satisfied smile, she clicked post and waited for the likes and supportive comments to roll in. However, Karen had not anticipated what was to come. Her post spread quickly, but in a very different way than she had imagined. Other videos, captured by witnesses at the scene, began to circulate, revealing a different scenario, that of an upper-class woman unfairly confronting a homeless veteran and unjustifiably accusing the police. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Karen's page was flooded with criticism, and even those close to her began to distance themselves. Her phone kept receiving notifications, with each new message bringing more disapproval. As the night wore on, Karen's confidence began to crumble. She had always considered herself a community advocate, but now, under the watchful eye of the public, she was forced to face an uncomfortable truth: perhaps she was not the hero she had imagined. Meanwhile, in a shelter across town, John lay on a narrow bed, Officer Rodriguez's business card clutched in his hand. As he fell asleep, he wondered if the next day might hold any hope for change. Little did Karen and John know that their paths would cross again in unexpected ways, and the events of that morning in the park would have significant implications. As dawn broke, Karen woke to a very different reality. Her phone, which had been silenced during the night, was full of missed calls, texts, and social media notifications. When she checked, she felt a knot in her stomach when she saw that the story had been featured on the local news. Her face appeared next to headlines like "Woman Confronts Homeless Veteran, Racism in Oakwood Park." Watching the videos of herself, visibly angry, Karen felt regret for the words she had said. As she was getting ready for work, the phone rang. It was her boss. "Karen, we need to talk. Come to my office as soon as you can." On her way to work, she felt anxious and embarrassed. As she walked into the office, she noticed the suspicious looks of her coworkers. The room fell silent as she walked by. When she finally entered her boss's office, he was blunt: "Your actions have brought a lot of negative attention to the company." This goes against our values. Unfortunately, we will have to let you go. Hours later, Karen left the building with a box of belongings, feeling as if her world had turned upside down in a single day. She sat in her car, tears streaming down her face as she faced the consequences of her choices. Across town, John was having a very different day. He had called the number Officer Rodriguez had given him and, to his surprise, was able to get an appointment that very morning. When he arrived at the Veterans Center, he was warmly greeted by David Martinez, the man the officer had mentioned. "John Williams, right? Mike told me about you. Let's see how we can help you turn things around." John was quickly immersed in a series of activities. David guided him through the complicated process of obtaining housing assistance, connected him to a PTSD support group, and even managed to enroll him in a job training program. As he left the center that afternoon, John felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. The road ahead would still be long and full of challenges, but for the first time in years, he believed he could overcome it. Little did John know that his path would soon cross again with the woman who had caused him so much pain the day before. Their stories were far from over, with surprises yet to come. Meanwhile, a week after the incident in the park, Karen's life had changed dramatically. She had lost her job, many of her friends had drifted away, and leaving the house had become difficult, as she felt constant judgment from her neighbors. Sitting in the kitchen, scrolling through job listings on her laptop, Karen was overcome with a deep sense of loneliness and regret. The anger that had fueled her actions that day was gone, replaced by a bitter sense of shame and a desire to right her wrongs. With a deep sigh, she closed her laptop and decided to go outside to clear her head, trying to escape the suffocating atmosphere of her home. Without thinking much about her destination, her steps took her to Oakwood Park. As she approached the entrance, she hesitated. This was where it had all started. A part of her wanted to go back, to escape the world that now seemed so hostile, but something was driving her to move forward, as if it were necessary to face her mistakes. The park was quiet in the late afternoon, and as Karen walked along the paths she knew so well, she found herself near the bench where she had met John. To her surprise, he was there again, silently watching the pond. Her heart raced. Her first impulse was to move away, but she resisted. She took a deep breath and walked closer. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft, a far cry from the stern tone of a week ago. "Mr. Williams?" John looked up, recognizing her immediately. He tensed visibly, uncomfortable in her presence. "I owe you an apology," Karen continued, her voice shaking. "What I did last week was unforgivable. I treated you horribly, and I am truly sorry." John stared at her in silence for a long time, his expression hard to read. Karen, feeling exposed and vulnerable, waited for an answer that never seemed to come. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "Why are you really here, ma'am? Is it because you're truly sorry or because your life has fallen apart?" John's words hit her hard, but she knew he was right. Slowly, Karen sat down on the opposite end of the bench, leaving plenty of space between them. "You're right to question my motives," she admitted. "The truth is, I'm here for both reasons. Yes, my life has been turned upside down, and that's part of why I came. But it's also made me reflect on myself, my actions, and the beliefs I held. And I don't like what I see." John remained silent, his gaze fixed on the lake in front of him, as Karen continued, the words coming out quickly. "I spent so much of my life judging others, thinking I was superior, but this week has shown me how wrong I was. I lost my job, my friends, but more than that, I lost respect for myself. I know that apologizing doesn't fix everything, but I needed you to know that I deeply regret what I did and I'm trying to do better." As she finished speaking, Karen realized that tears were streaming down her face. She quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by the display of emotion. John remained silent for what seemed like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but gentle. "I appreciate your apology, ma'am, but you're right, it doesn't fix anything. Words are cheap, it's actions that count. Karen nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness. I just had to say that. She stood up to leave, but John's voice stopped her. Mrs. Whitfield. Karen. Karen Whitfield, she replied. John nodded. Ms. Whitfield, I can't say I forgive you yet, but I do believe in second chances. The fact that you're here and trying to make amends counts for something. Karen felt a glimmer of hope in his words. Thank you, Mr. Williams. I promise I'll do my best to be a better person. As she walked away, a mix of emotions washed over her, shame for her past actions, relief that she had taken the first step, and a renewed determination to keep her promise. What Karen didn't know was that this conversation was just the beginning of a challenging journey that would take her to unexpected places, including an unlikely friendship. Over the next few weeks, she threw herself into volunteering, eager to make a positive impact in her community. She started helping out at a soup kitchen, preparing food and serving meals to those in need. The work was hard and often thankless, but Karen found a sense of purpose in it that she had never felt in her previous job. One afternoon, while clearing the tables after lunch, Karen noticed a familiar face enter the kitchen. It was John, accompanied by David Martinez from the Veteran Center. Karen froze for a moment, unsure how to react. David saw her and waved. Karen, right? I've heard about you. Come say hello to John. Karen nervously approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Hello, Mr. Williams. It's good to see you again. John nodded and gave a small smile. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, David told me you've been volunteering here for a while. Yes, Karen replied, surprised by the lack of hostility in John's tone. I'm trying to do something for the community to make up for my mistakes. David, sensing the connection between them, commented, John has been making great progress. He's in a transitional housing program now and starts a job training course next week. We thought he might want to give back a little, too, so we came to look at volunteer opportunities. Karen's face lit up. That's wonderful, Mr. Williams. I'm so glad to hear things are looking up for you. John's expression softened a little at her words. Thank you, it's been a long journey, but I'm making progress, John said. While David went to talk to the volunteer coordinator, Karen and John found themselves alone, and the silence between them was thick with unspoken feelings. Finally, Karen broke the silence. Mr. Williams, I know I've said this before, but I deeply regret how I treated you. I was wrong, and every day I try to be a better person. John looked at her for a moment before responding, I can see that, Mrs. Whitfield. It takes courage to admit your mistakes and seek change. I respect that. Karen felt an immediate relief at his words. Thank you, that means a lot, especially coming from you. When David returned with information about volunteer opportunities, Karen had an idea. Mr. Williams, if you're interested, I can mentor you here. It may be a little confusing at first, but the work is really rewarding. John hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. I would appreciate that, Mrs. Whitfield. Thank you. And so began an unlikely partnership. Over the next few weeks, the two worked side by side in the soup kitchen. At first, their interactions were tense and uncomfortable, both aware of their complicated backgrounds. But over time, they found a rhythm to their work, and a cautious friendship began to develop. Karen learned about John's experiences in the military, his struggles returning to civilian life, and the challenges of living on the streets. John, in turn, began to see a different Karen, someone humble, hardworking, and genuinely committed to making a difference. One evening, as they were closing up the kitchen, John turned to Karen and said, You know, Mrs. Whitfield, when I met you in that park, I never imagined we would be here today. Karen laughed softly. Neither did I, Mr. Williams. And please call me Karen. John smiled. Then I insist you call me John. As they walked outside, into the cool night air, Karen felt a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew there was still a long way to go, and that a single good deed could not make up for a lifetime of mistakes. But for the first time, she was convinced she was on the right path. She also had no idea that her friendship with John was about to face a major test. Over the next few weeks, they would both be challenged in unexpected ways, forced to face their greatest fears and prejudices. But it was in the process that they would discover the transformative power of empathy, forgiveness, and second chances. As summer turned to fall, Karen and John's unlikely friendship continued to blossom. They volunteered regularly at the soup kitchen and occasionally met for coffee, sharing more about their lives. Karen had gotten a new job, albeit in a much lower position than she had before, and was slowly rebuilding her life. John, on the other hand, was excelling in the job training program and had moved into a more stable place to live. One cold October morning, Karen arrived at the park for her usual walk. When she approached the bench where she had first met John, she was surprised to see him sitting there, his head in his hands. Concerned, she called out, "John." His voice was clearly worried. John looked up, and Karen was shocked to see tears in his eyes. "Karen," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I don't know what to do." Karen immediately sat down next to him, her walk completely forgotten. "What happened?" she asked anxiously. John took a deep breath before answering. "I got a call from my daughter last night. My ex-wife, she has cancer. It's serious. She doesn't have much time left." He paused, trying to control his emotion. "My daughter asked me to come see them, help them, and say goodbye." Karen's heart went out to her friend. "Oh, John. I'm so sorry. You have to go." John, however, shook his head, clearly frustrated. "It's not that simple. They're in California, and I can't afford the trip. And even if I could, I haven't seen my family in years." He trailed off, and Karen realized the depth of the pain he'd been carrying since he'd been away from everyone. Without a second thought, Karen placed her hand on John's arm. "Listen, John. You need to be with your family now. The rest, we'll figure it out." Over the next few days, Karen devoted herself to helping him prepare for the trip. She used her connections to get him a discounted plane ticket and helped him get a temporary leave of absence from the training program, ensuring that his spot would be secure when he returned. On the morning of the flight, Karen drove John to the airport. When they reached security, John turned to her, his eyes full of gratitude. "Karen, I don't know how to thank you for all this," he said softly. Karen smiled and shook her head. "You don't have to thank me, John. That's what friends do." As John disappeared into the security line, Karen was overcome with a mix of emotions. Pride at how far they had come, concern for what he would face with his family, and a strange sense of emptiness at the thought of how long it would be before she saw him again. Karen never imagined that John's trip would trigger a series of events that would test their friendship in unexpected ways. In the weeks that followed, she threw herself into volunteer work, trying to fill the void left by John's absence. She missed their conversations, the bond they had built. She worried about him. How was he dealing with his ex-wife's illness and reuniting with the family he had been estranged from for so long? One night, as she was leaving the soup kitchen, Karen heard something that made her freeze. Two volunteers were talking, and one of them said, "Did you hear about that veteran who scammed an old lady? He made up a sad story about his sick ex-wife to get money to travel to California. Now he's taken the money." Karen's heart raced. She wanted to believe they weren't talking about John, but the details were too similar to ignore. In the days that followed, she tried to contact him several times, but her calls went straight to voicemail. Concerned, she called David at the Veterans Center, only to discover that John had not contacted them either. Doubts began to creep in. Had she been deceived? Had her desire for redemption blinded her to reality? As the weeks passed without any news, Karen struggled with conflicting feelings. Part of her wanted to believe in John, in the friendship they had built. Yet an inner voice, shaped by years of distrust and prejudice, suggested that perhaps she had been naive and that John had taken advantage of her guilt. The tipping point came when a local news station reported a story about a man accused of deceiving well-meaning people. During the broadcast, a woman recounted an experience eerily similar to Karen's. She had also met John in a park, felt guilty for initially judging him, and ended up helping him financially. Now, like Karen, she had not heard from him in weeks. Watching the report, Karen was overcome with a growing sense of horror. Her mind struggled to process whether everything she had experienced, the friendship, the personal growth, the sense of redemption, had been a lie. With a heavy heart, she picked up the phone and began dialing the number for the news station, feeling responsible for sharing what she knew. But before she could press the call button, her cell phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was California. With shaking hands, Karen answered. "Hello." The voice on the other end was familiar but tense. "Karen, it's me, John. I'm sorry I haven't been in touch. Things have been complicated." A wave of relief washed over Karen, but it was quickly replaced by anger and confusion. "John, where have you been? Do you have any idea what's going on here?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When John spoke again, his voice was thick with exhaustion and emotion. "Karen, I can explain everything, but I need your help. Can you come to California?" Karen's mind spun. Part of her wanted to refuse, afraid of getting hurt again. But another part, the part that had grown and learned in the past few months, urged her to give him a chance to explain himself. "Okay, John," she said finally. "I'll go, but when I get there, you better have a convincing explanation." As she hung up the phone, Karen knew she was at a turning point in her life. Karen's decision to go to California could either confirm her newfound trust in people or reveal her worst fears of being manipulated. Either way, she knew that this trip would change her life. What Karen didn't yet realize was that the journey would not only shed light on the mystery surrounding John's disappearance, but also force her to confront her deepest prejudices and fears. The true test of their friendship and her own personal growth was yet to come. With her mind racing with conflicting emotions, Karen boarded the plane. Doubt, hope, anger, and worry swirled together as she relived their brief conversation over and over again. The flight seemed endless, and her anxiety only grew with each passing minute. When she finally landed in Los Angeles, Karen found herself making her way through the bustling airport until she spotted a familiar face in the crowd. John stood near the exit, visibly haggard and worn. When their eyes met, a flood of emotions passed between them. "Karen," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Thank you for coming. I know I have a lot to explain." She nodded cautiously. "Yes, I do. Let's find a place to talk." They headed to a small cafe near the airport. As they settled into a quiet booth, Karen couldn't help but notice how much older John looked, as if the recent events had taken years off his life. "So, John," she began firmly but not aggressively, "what's going on? Do you realize what they're saying about you back home?" John sighed, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "I know, Karen. I've heard it all. But I swear, none of it is true. I didn't deceive anyone. The situation here has gotten much more complicated than I could have ever anticipated." Over the next hour, John told the whole story. His ex-wife's condition had worsened dramatically, and without insurance, the medical bills had become exorbitant. Her daughter, dealing with her mother's illness and the reappearance of a father she barely knew, was filled with anger and confusion. "I wanted to call you to explain," John said, his eyes pleading for understanding, "but everything was happening so fast. And then my phone was stolen at the hospital, and I couldn't remember your number." As he spoke, Karen felt her anger and distrust dissipate, replaced by a deep sense of compassion. She reached out and gently took John's hand. "John," she said softly, "I'm so sorry you're going through this alone. But why didn't you ask David or someone else for help? John's eyes filled with tears. I tried, he admitted shakily, but I felt like I was failing again. Like I couldn't handle this on my own. When John heard the rumors circulating in his town, the fear of not being believed consumed him. Karen, remembering her own moments of uncertainty, felt a weight of guilt. I understand, she replied, but John, you're not alone anymore. Tell me how I can help. In the days that followed, Karen devoted herself to supporting John, helping him navigate the complications of medical bills, insurance, and family challenges. Using her professional skills, she organized fundraisers, negotiated with the hospital, and mediated conversations between John and his daughter. As they worked together, Karen came to admire John's resilience and compassion. Despite everything, he remained steadfast in his purpose to help his ex-wife and rebuild his relationship with his daughter. One night, as they waited at the hospital during a long vigil, John looked at Karen and said softly, "You know, months ago, I never would have imagined that the woman who called the police on me would end up being my greatest supporter. Life has its ironies, doesn't it?" Tears welled in Karen's eyes. "John, I can never apologize enough for how I acted that day, but I am grateful for the chance to make things right and be a true friend." Sitting in that cold, sterile hospital hallway, Karen realized how much they had both changed. They had evolved from a relationship marked by prejudice and distrust to one of empathy and genuine care. John, who had once felt isolated and desperate, now had a support system he could rely on. Their journey was far from over. John's ex-wife was still gravely ill, and many challenges lay ahead, but Karen knew that no matter what, they would face it together, as friends. United by a bond built on hardship and mutual growth. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of hospital visits, legal appointments, and emotional conversations. Karen extended her stay in California, using her days off to continue supporting John and his family. She watched with pride as he reconnected with his daughter, slowly rebuilding the trust that had been broken years before. One afternoon, as they were leaving the hospital after a difficult day, John's daughter Sarah pulled Karen aside. Her voice choked with emotion, she said, "I just want to thank you for being there for my dad, for all of us. I didn't trust him when he came back, but seeing how you supported him made me see the man he's become." Karen's throat tightened, overcome with gratitude. "Your father is an incredible person, Sarah. I'm glad I had the opportunity to meet him and make amends for my past mistakes." As the days passed, John's ex-wife made some progress and was transferred to a hospice. The atmosphere held a sense of farewell, but also of serenity, with emotional wounds being healed and forgiveness being granted. On Karen's last night in California, before returning home, she and John walked along the beach, watching the sunset as it tinted the sky orange and pink. In a moment of pause, John looked at her. "I can't thank you enough for everything. You've helped me reconnect with my family, face my past, and find strength I never knew I had." Karen smiled through her tears. "You don't have to thank me, John. You've taught me so much about resilience, forgiveness, and the value of second chances. Our friendship has changed my life." As the waves gently lapped at their feet, they both reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from their initial confrontation in the park, marked by prejudice and fear, to a true friendship based on understanding and respect. Karen's journey home was filled with mixed feelings, sadness at leaving John's family, concern for his ex-wife's health, but also a sense of hope for the future, knowing that they had each other. As they landed at the airport, Karen remembered the news that had circulated about John. "Oh no. What are we going to do about the rumors? People still think you're a cheater." John calmly squeezed her hand. "We'll get through this together, Karen. The truth is on our side." In the days that followed, they dedicated themselves to clearing John's name. They contacted the network that had broken the story, providing proof of where John had been and explaining the real reason for his absence. They also sought support from the Veterans Center, which helped clarify the situation. It wasn't easy. Some people chose to believe the worst, clinging to their prejudices. But as the real story came out, public opinion began to shift. The woman who had initially accused John of being a con artist backtracked, admitting that she had jumped to conclusions and apologizing for her role in spreading false information. The network ran a follow-up story, this time highlighting John's dedication to his family and Karen's unwavering support. As the truth spread, Karen and John began to attract a different kind of attention. Their story of unlikely friendship and personal resilience deeply touched everyone who knew them. They began to be invited to community events, where they shared their experiences and the lessons they had learned about overcoming prejudice and the value of second chances. One evening, after a talk at a local church, a woman approached them with tears in her eyes. "Your story," she said, taking their hands, "gave me hope. Hope that people can change, that we can overcome our differences and find common ground. Thank you for sharing that." Karen and John exchanged glances, feeling the impact of their journey. What had begun as a divide caused by prejudice had now become a joint mission to spread empathy, forgiveness, and the transformative power of friendship. As they walked together that evening, Karen turned to John and said, "You know, when I called the police on you that day in the park, I thought I was protecting my community. I never imagined that you would be the one to show me the true meaning of community." John smiled softly. "And I never thought the woman who saw me as a threat would become my greatest friend and advocate. Life has its ironies, doesn't it?" Their journey didn't end there. A few months later, John's ex-wife passed away, and Karen was there for him and Sarah, offering support as they grieved. Together, they created a foundation in her memory, with the goal of helping homeless veterans reintegrate into society. Karen followed her own path of growth, becoming an active advocate for social justice and community service. With Karen's encouragement, John pursued his dream of becoming a counselor for veterans struggling with PTSD and homelessness. Their friendship remained a cornerstone in their lives, a constant reminder of the power of seeing beyond first impressions and the importance of second chances. Years later, as they sat on the same park bench where it all began, they reflected on how far they had come. The park had changed, and so had they, but the bench remained the same, a symbol of their journey. "You know, John," Karen said, her voice thick with emotion, "I used to think that this bench was mine, that I had some right to it. Now I realize that it belongs to everyone, just like the park and our community. We're all in this together." John, his eyes shining, agreed. "That's the greatest lesson of all, isn't it? We're all human, deserving of kindness and understanding, no matter where we come from or what we look like." Dear viewers, at the end of this moving story, we are left with a powerful message: change is possible, and together we can build a more just and compassionate world. Redemption is within everyone's reach, and true friendship can overcome even the most difficult barriers. If you were in Karen's shoes, would you have found the strength to apologize and make amends? Or, if you were John, would you be able to forgive someone who treated you badly in the beginning? Leave your opinion in the comments, I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you for joining us on this journey of transformation. If this story touched your heart as it did ours, I've selected another inspiring narrative that I'm sure you'll love. Don't miss it, click here and watch it now.